Hello and welcome to our instructional series of videos. In this installment, we're going to show you how to replace the battery in mid-2012 through early 2013 15-inch Retina MacBook Pros. This process involves the use of flammable substances and runs the risk of fire or personal injury if the battery you're removing gets damaged during removal. For your safety, be sure to both read all the information included with your kit and watch this video in its entirety before proceeding. For this installation, it's vital that we drain the battery until the computer shuts down to reduce risk of accidental ignition of the battery. We've already drained the battery, gathered our materials, and are working on a soft static-free work surface. We're now ready to begin. The first thing to do is place the cloth that came with your kit over the keyboard of your MacBook Pro and close the lid to help protect your screen in case of any spillage of the adhesive remover. We can now remove the bottom cover. Start with the two pentalobe screws in the center of the hinge edge as they're smaller than the others. You can then remove the remaining 8 pentalobe screws. Lift off the bottom cover and set it aside. Disconnect the battery by lifting up on its large central connector. Next, remove the SSD by first removing the retaining screw, then sliding the drive out of its socket. The next thing to remove is the wireless card. Detach the antenna cables from the wireless card by unsnapping them from their connectors. Then, remove the Torx T5 screw holding the card in place. Then slide the card itself out of its socket. Then, remove the I/O board cable by gently lifting up on the connectors on each side until they come free. You can then slide the camera cable connector out of its socket. Lift up on the latch for the fan cable's ZIF connector. Then, peel back the rubber cover off the fan Then lift the antenna and camera cables out of the way. We can now remove the fan itself by first removing these 3 Torx T5 screws. Each screw is different, so keep track of which one goes where. You should now be able to lift up on the fan and gently unstick the cable from the logic board. The connector should slide right out of its socket. To remove the I/O board, first remove the camera and antenna cables from their guide on the top of the board. Next, lift up the latching handle on the lower I/O board cable, then slide the connector out of its slot. Then, remove the 2 Torx T5 screws holding the I/O board in place. You should now be able to lift the board up and out of the MacBook Pro. Next, peel back the rubber cover off the left fan. Then, lift the left speaker cable connector out of its socket and disconnect the headphone jack connector. Lift the latch on the display data cable and slide it out of its socket. Then, lift up on the latch for the fan cable ZIF connector. Then, remove the 3 screws holding the fan in place. Again, each screw is different, so be sure to keep track of which goes where. Finally, like before, lift the fan out of the MacBook Pro, then peel the cable up from the logic board if necessary, and remove it from its socket. Remove the rubber cap from this Torx T5 screw near the heatsink, and then remove the screw itself. Then, peel back the label covering the keyboard connector cable, then lift up the bar to open its ZIF connection, and slide the cable free. You can then detach the trackpad connector by lifting it up and away from the logic board. Peel back the edge of the label that covers the battery connector and remove the Torx T5 screw near the edge that holds the battery in place. Then, do the same on the other side. You can then lift the battery slightly to make it easier to detach the right speaker connector. We can now remove the Torx T5 screws that hold the logic board in place. Start with this one near where the SSD used to be. Then the 2 near the center of the hinge edge, then this one near the memory. And finally, this silver screw near the heatsink. Next, lift the bar of the microphone's ZIF socket and slide the cable free. Then, lift the keyboard backlight cable connector from its socket. Finally, remove the 2 Torx T5 screws holding the MagSafe connector in place. You should now be able to carefully lift the logic board out of the MacBook Pro. We can now remove the right speaker. Do this by removing the 3 screws that hold it in place, then lifting it up and out of the MacBook Pro. Do the same for the left speaker. At this point, we're going to be working with adhesive remover, so be sure you're working in a well-ventilated area and use the protective glasses and gloves included with your kit. Using the syringe also included in the kit, apply about 1/4 milliliter of adhesive remover under one of the outer battery cells and let it sit for about a minute or so. Then, starting at a corner, work one of the plastic cards underneath the battery cell, slicing through the weakened adhesive strips until it comes free. You can use more adhesive remover if you need to, but try and use as little as possible. Once the first cell is free, move it out of the way and repeat the process on the second cell. Once both cells are loose, use one of the plastic cards to hold them up from the surface of the MacBook Pro so they don't accidentally re-adhere. You can now repeat the process with the two outer cells on the other side. Use a tiny bead of adhesive remover to dissolve the edge of the plastic near the bottom front of the battery. You should then be able to work one of the cards underneath the center cells. Then, let about a quarter milliliter of adhesive remover drip down the card under the battery where it can sit for a minute. Then, use the card to slice at the softened adhesive. As you progress, you may be able to come at it from other directions to get both cells free. Once all the cells have been detached, you should be able to lift the whole battery unit up and out of the MacBook Pro. While it's optional, it's generally a good idea to remove the remaining adhesive from the MacBook so that the new battery has a clean surface to adhere to. To do this, simply use a little of the adhesive remover and use your nylon tool to scrape it up until you can peel it the rest of the way off. Once you're done, wipe up any extra adhesive remover and let the MacBook sit for about half an hour to ensure everything is evaporated and dried. Now it's time to reassemble your MacBook Pro. Start by replacing the left speaker assembly. Simply slide it into place, then secure it with its 3 screws. The short screw goes in the top hole. The long collared screw goes in the center hole, and the long full thread screw goes in the bottom hole. Repeat the process for the right speaker. Taking care that no cables are trapped underneath, set the logic board back into place, making sure it sits flat within the MacBook Pro. Replace the 2 Torx T5 screws that hold the MagSafe connector in place. Then, replace the longer silver screw near the heatsink and set its rubber cap back on top. Then, replace the other silver screw on the other side. The smallest logic board screw goes in the hole under the SSD bay. The 2 longest screws are the same length and go into the 2 holes along the hinge edge. Finally, the last screw goes in the hole near the memory. We can now reattach a number of cables and boards. Set the I/O board back into place, making sure that it lays flat without anything trapped underneath. Then, secure it with its 2 Torx T5 screws, which are both the same length. Attach the lower I/O cable by sliding it into its socket and using the handle to latch it in place. We can now replace the right fan. Slide the fan cable into its ZIF socket and latch it down. Set the fan flat and replace the Torx T5 screws with the shortest large-headed screw on the inside. The full threaded screw on the lower edge, and the collared screw in the corner. You can now route all the cables along their guide on the I/O board, lay the cables across the fan, and slide the camera cable connector into its socket. Next, align the wireless card with its socket, slide it into place, and secure it with its single screw. You can now attach the antenna cables by lining up their connectors and snapping them together. The cables should position themselves over the appropriate connectors. Then, align the SSD card with its socket, slide it into place, and secure it with its single screw. Attach the I/O ribbon cable to its connectors on the logic board and I/O board by pressing them into place. Next is the right speaker cable. This just lines up with its connector vertically and snaps into place. The last connector on this side we need to worry about is the keyboard backlight cable, which also simply snaps into place. On the other side, first snap the trackpad connector cable into its socket. Then, reconnect the keyboard by sliding its cable back into the ZIF connector until fully seated, then locking it into place with the lever on the back. Next, reconnect the right speaker cable like we did the left, and press the headphone jack connector into its socket. The microphone connector slides into its ZIF socket, which then locks to keep it secured. Then, slide the display data cable into its socket and latch it into place. Now we can replace the left fan in the same way as we did the right. Slide the fan cable into its ZIF socket and latch it down. Set the fan flat, and replace the Torx T5 screws from the top inside to the lower outer with the shortest large-headed screw, the collared screw, and the full threaded screw. Finally, flip the two rubber covers back down into place over the fans and we're ready to install the battery itself. First, peel off the paper covering the adhesive on the back of the new battery. Then, line up the battery connector with its socket and press it into place. Then, set the battery into its bay. Replace the two battery board retaining screws and then press down lightly on the battery itself to make sure it adheres to the case. We can now replace the bottom cover and screws. Start with the two center screws along the hinge edge as they're shorter than the others. Then, replace the remaining 8 screws. You can now open your MacBook Pro, remove the protective cloth, and charge and condition your battery according to guidelines. First, shut your computer all the way down. Then, attach the power adapter. The light on the adapter should turn amber to show that the battery is charging. Once the battery is 100% charged, the light should turn green. Once it has, you should leave it connected for at least 2 more hours. However, you can use your computer during this time rather than leaving it off. After that, we'll need to discharge the battery. First, in the Energy Saver Preference pane, make sure all the sliders are set to the right and any power saving measures like sleeping the hard drive are turned off. Do this for both the power adapter and the battery settings. Once you've done that, disconnect the power cable and let the battery discharge completely until the computer shuts down. You can still use it at this time, but don't do anything particularly heavy. Steady and even usage will result in better power system calibration. Once the battery is discharged, your computer will automatically shut down. Leave it shut down for at least 5 hours to ensure the battery is completely drained. Finally, reattach the power cable and let the battery charge back up to 100%. This time, you can use the computer while it's charging. Once the battery is charged back up, the power management system is properly calibrated. You can now set your energy saver settings back to what they were before and use your computer normally.